February 1944. The skies above Germany are a frozen cathedral of war. Thin contrails carve pale scars across the morning light as the Luftwaffe's elite rise from their airfields. Engines roaring, hearts steady. For years, they have ruled these skies. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf. 190s once struck fear into every Allied crew that dared to cross the Rhine. Their commanders boast that no American bomber will ever reach Berlin. But today, something is different. At 20,000 feet, through the shimmer of the sun, tiny shapes appear. Sleek, silver, faster than anything the Germans have seen this deep into their homeland. They move with calm precision, wings flashing the unmistakable white star of the United States. The radio chatter falters. Begleitschutz. Escorts, this far? One voice murmurs. The first Mustangs dive, engines howling like a sudden storm. And, for the first time, German pilots realize the truth. The hunters of Europe have become the hunted. The age of the Luftwaffe's dominance is ending. A new force has arrived from nowhere. When war erupted in September 1939, the world witnessed a new dimension of combat, the dominance of air power. While armies clashed across Poland, it was the shadow of the Luftwaffe that terrified Europe. The German Air Force, meticulously built under the vision of Hermann Göring and General Erhard Milch, represented the most advanced aerial fighting force on Earth. Its doctrine was simple: control the air, and you control the battlefield. From the blitzkrieg lightning strikes over Poland and France to the burning skies above Dunkirk, the Luftwaffe's precision and coordination stunned the world. Its fighters, the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the rugged Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, tore apart enemy resistance. Air superiority was no longer a supporting factor of war. It had become its spearhead. In those early years, no opponent could match German training or tactics. Luftwaffe pilots were not just skilled, they were seasoned by years of civil war in Spain, where they honed aerial combat and perfected close air support. Each new conquest reinforced the same belief within the German ranks, that the skies belonged to them by right. When Britain refused to yield in 1940, the Battle of Britain became the first test of that confidence. German bombers streaked over the Channel, escorted by swarms of Bf-109s. Yet the RAF, fighting on home ground, turned the tide. Radar, discipline, and the unyielding courage of outnumbered pilots prevented invasion. Still, the Luftwaffe left the battle convinced that their superiority in fighter design and combat experience remained intact. The defeat was strategic, not moral. In 1941, as Hitler turned east, the Luftwaffe once again dominated the vast skies over the Soviet Union. The first months of Operation Barbarossa saw entire Soviet air fleets destroyed on the ground. German fighter aces like Werner Mulders, Adolf Galland, and Günter Lützow became household names, their kill counts mounting into the hundreds. The myth of invincibility deepened. But war in the air is a war of distance, fuel, and endurance. And by 1942, cracks began to show. While the Luftwaffe fought across multiple fronts, the Mediterranean, the Eastern Front, and now North Africa, its reach began to thin. The United States had entered the war, and a new kind of threat emerged: American industrial power. Across the Atlantic, factories in Detroit and California thundered day and night. They produced bombers at a rate no nation could match. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Ertins, B-24 Liberator became the symbols of American resolve, massive, heavily armed, and capable of delivering tons of explosives with precision. By 1943, these bombers were appearing in European skies, flying under the banner of the U.S. 8th Air Force. Their mission was audacious: daylight bombing raids deep into the heart of Germany. Their goal? Cripple the Reich's war industry and shatter its morale from above. But there was a flaw. The bombers could fly high and carry heavy loads, but they could not defend themselves forever. American escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning had the speed and firepower, but lacked one thing: range. Once the bombers crossed deep into Germany, the escorts turned back, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. The German interceptors descended like hawks from the sun. Entire squadrons of bombers were torn apart before reaching their targets. Crews fell burning from the sky. On some missions, losses exceeded 20 to 30%, unsustainable numbers for any air force. Still, the Americans kept coming. The idea was clear: precision daylight bombing would shorten the war. But in reality, it was slaughter. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force faced a crisis. German pilots, once seen as mere adversaries, now appeared unbeatable. Reports from returning crews were grim. Endless waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s cutting through bomber formations with surgical precision. Luftwaffe confidence was absolute. One German ace reportedly said, "They come to die above Germany." It wasn't arrogance, it was observation. In the airfields of occupied Europe, German ground crews watched as smoke plumes rose from destroyed bomber groups, convinced the Americans would soon abandon their futile strategy. To them, the Reich's airspace was still sacred, untouchable. But behind the calm confidence of the Luftwaffe, deep in Allied planning rooms in London and Washington, another idea was forming. One that would alter the balance of the skies forever. The solution would not come from numbers or luck. It would come from innovation. In the summer of 1943, the American air war over Europe was approaching a breaking point. The dream of precision daylight bombing was colliding with brutal reality. Each mission into Germany exacted a price so high that even the bravest crews questioned whether the strategy could last. The numbers told the story better than any propaganda. In the infamous raids against Regensburg and Schweinfurt, vital centers of German aircraft production, the 8th Air Force lost nearly 1 out of every 5 bombers. Hundreds of airmen vanished into smoke-filled skies, their parachutes flickering against the clouds. Those who survived often returned in silence, their formations shattered, their aircraft riddled with holes. Without long-range fighter escort, the American bombers were effectively flying blind into the Reich's killing fields. The Luftwaffe exploited this weakness mercilessly. From bases in France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, German interceptors waited patiently until the escorts turned back. Then, like a gate opening to hell, they swarmed. Bf-109s slashed through bomber boxes. FW-190s made head-on attacks that tore through the fortress's aluminum shells. Crews were left defenseless. In Washington and London, Allied commanders faced an agonizing truth. Without air superiority, victory in Europe was impossible. Before the invasion of France could even be considered, Germany's war industry had to be broken. But to do that, the bombers had to reach their targets and return. The question now was how. In 1940, the British Air Purchasing Commission had approached the North American Aviation Company with a simple request: build more Curtiss P-40 Warhawks for the Royal Air Force. But the company's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, offered something bolder: to design a brand new fighter from scratch. In just 117 days, engineers rolled out the first prototype of what they called the NA-73X. It was sleek, with laminar flow wings that reduced drag and a revolutionary cooling system. The British named it the Mustang. At first, it wasn't extraordinary. The early versions used the Allison engine, performing well at low altitudes but faltering above 15,000 feet, far below the bomber lanes over Europe. It seemed destined to serve as a low-level reconnaissance aircraft. Then came a stroke of genius. In 1942, British engineers suggested fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary performance. The transformation was immediate. The new P-51B and P-51C models could climb faster, fly higher, and, most importantly, reach targets more than 1,500 miles away. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. In late 1943, as the first Mustangs reached the 8th Air Force in England, few fully grasped what their arrival meant. On the airfields of East Anglia, young American pilots climbed into the new aircraft and felt an unfamiliar sensation: confidence. The P-51 was light yet deadly. Its range allowed it to roam deep into enemy airspace, while its 650 caliber machine guns gave it the bite to take on anything the Luftwaffe could field. It was fast, stable, and forgiving. A pilot's aircraft, but machines alone don't change wars. Doctrine does. In January 1944, General James Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, issued a radical order. The fighters would no longer stick to tight escort formations. Their mission wasn't just to protect the bombers, it was to destroy the Luftwaffe. American pilots were unleashed. They were told to hunt the hunters. When the first P-51 groups crossed deep into Germany, Luftwaffe interceptors tried to engage as usual. But the trap was reversed. Instead of retreating, the Mustangs pursued. They met the German fighters head-on, forcing combat far from the bomber formations. At first, German commanders dismissed these new arrivals as another Allied experiment. But mission by mission, the results spoke for themselves. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. By the dawn of 1944, something unseen since 1939 was happening. German airfields were under attack. Mustang squadrons began strafing runways, fuel depots, and parked aircraft. Now, the Luftwaffe could not even rise into the air without facing death before takeoff. To Göring, it was unthinkable. The Reich's once invincible shield was cracking. He reportedly muttered in disbelief, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." It was not a poetic exaggeration. It was prophecy, because from that moment, the skies of Europe would no longer belong to Germany. They would belong to the silver wings of the Mustang. For years, German fighter pilots carried an aura of invincibility. They were the knights of a modern age. Men like Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, and Gerhard Barkhorn, names whispered with awe across both sides of the front. Many had survived since the earliest campaigns in Poland and France. They had fought the RAF, the Soviets, the Americans, and lived. Their confidence was not arrogance born from propaganda. It was experience. Each man had endured hundreds of sorties, dozens of kills, and the belief that skill alone could defy the odds. Luftwaffe squadrons were small, elite, and tightly bonded. Each pilot was a veteran among veterans. But when the P-51s arrived, that certainty began to fracture. At first, the change was subtle. Unfamiliar aircraft appearing on radar screens, flashes of polished metal where none had been before. Then came the losses. Aces who had once dictated every dogfight began to vanish. Reports came in of long-range American fighters striking deep beyond escort zones, ambushing German formations as they climbed to intercept bombers. It was psychological warfare in motion. The Luftwaffe's greatest weapon, the fear it commanded, was turned back upon itself. For the first time since 1939, German pilots spoke of dread before takeoff. They were still skilled, still brave, but the battlefield had changed beneath them. They could no longer predict where or when they'd meet the enemy. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, a new generation of American fighter pilots, many barely in their 20s, were learning the art of aerial combat under the unforgiving European sky. Unlike their German counterparts, they weren't veterans of multiple wars. They were students of technology and discipline. The Mustang became their teacher. It taught them confidence. It taught them control. It gave them something the Luftwaffe no longer had: time to choose the fight. In the air, human will met the limits of endurance. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe blinked. Every war is a contest of machines as much as men. The Mustang's legend was not born in myth, but in mathematics, in the precise harmony between aerodynamics and engine power. The original P-51 design had been ahead of its time. The laminar flow wing, a near-revolutionary concept in the early 1940s, minimized drag by keeping airflow smooth across the wing's surface. This allowed higher speeds and longer range with less fuel, a quiet innovation that would change aircraft design forever. But it was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, coupled with an American-built airframe, that created something transcendent. The Merlin transformed the Mustang into a high-altitude predator. It could climb to over 40,000 feet, cruise above 400 miles per hour, and, most crucially, travel over 1,600 miles with drop tanks. That meant Berlin, Leipzig, and Munich were all within reach, not just for bombers, but for their escorts. To Luftwaffe intelligence officers, the data made no sense. No fighter could possibly fly that far, fight that hard, and still return home. But the Americans had achieved what German engineers could not: a perfect balance between speed, agility, and endurance. The Mustang could turn tighter than the FW-190, dive faster than the Bf-109, and maintain power at altitudes where German engines began to choke. Its 6 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns shredded aircraft at long range. Yet, it wasn't raw firepower that defined it. It was reliability. German pilots knew their aircraft intimately, but they also knew their weaknesses: unreliable engines, dwindling fuel quality, maintenance delays, and overworked crews. The Mustang, by contrast, simply worked. Day after day, mission after mission, technology became the equalizer, and then the advantage. Where Germany's innovation had peaked in 1941, America's was still climbing. The Mustang was not just a machine of war, it was a symbol of an industrial power that could outthink, outbuild, and outlast any empire. The Mustang's arrival did not merely save the bombers, it rewrote the entire Allied air strategy. Before 1944, the U.S. daylight bombing campaign had been a war of attrition the Allies could not sustain. The Luftwaffe dictated when and where engagements happened. Every mission required complex coordination, and every withdrawal felt like a retreat. The Mustang reversed that equation. When General Jimmy Doolittle took command, he understood something that many still resisted. Winning air superiority required destroying the enemy's air force, not merely surviving it. His new order, to allow fighters free range to hunt the Luftwaffe, turned the air war from defense to offense. Now, it was the Germans reacting, not leading. Mustang groups began sweeping German skies before the bombers arrived, clearing the way. They struck airfields, shot down reconnaissance planes, and disrupted German coordination. The once predictable rhythm of interception collapsed. The results were immediate and devastating. In early 1944 alone, Luftwaffe losses reached levels that no replacement program could sustain. Veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and with each loss, the strategic structure of the Reich's defense eroded. By the time the bombers appeared, the sky was half empty. What few German fighters did take off often faced overwhelming odds. Pursued by Mustangs, all the way back to their bases, air warfare had transformed from a tactical duel into a campaign of annihilation. Removing the Luftwaffe from the sky, the Allies were opening the door for the next phase of the war, the invasion of Western Europe. For the men on the ground in Normandy, the success of D-Day would depend not only on courage, but on one silent fact. The sky belonged to the Allies, and the Mustang made it so. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, was now bleeding at every altitude. But beneath the loss of aircraft and pilots, something deeper was happening. A crisis of faith. Inside the command rooms of the Reich Air Ministry, the mood in early 1944 had changed from confidence to quiet disbelief. Daily reports from the front lines were growing shorter, the casualty lists longer. Each new briefing carried the same grim message. Losses unsustainable. The Luftwaffe's defensive network, once the pride of Europe, was beginning to collapse under the strain of endless combat. Veteran pilots, those who had carried the Luftwaffe through its golden years, were vanishing. Many were dead. Others were simply exhausted. Training new flyers was no longer possible at the scale required. The advanced schools that once produced elite aviators had been stripped of fuel and aircraft. In their place came teenagers, barely trained, often with only a handful of hours in the cockpit, before being thrown into battle against the Americans' best. To the young recruits, the sky felt cursed. They took off, knowing that the Mustangs would find them before they could even climb to altitude. Luftwaffe commanders tried to adapt, dispersing airfields, shifting formations, developing new tactics. But every adjustment was countered within weeks. The Americans, backed by near-limitless resources, were evolving faster. Desperation forced Germany to turn to technology. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, offered a glimmer of hope. Its speed was unmatched, its armament deadly. But it arrived too late, too few, and with too little fuel. The Luftwaffe simply couldn't protect its own innovation. For the first time in the war, Germany faced a truth it could not disguise. It no longer ruled the skies. And with that, a psychological wall crumbled. The invincibility myth that had carried the Luftwaffe since 1939 was shattered by a single, unrelenting fact. The enemy could now fight everywhere, all the time. In private moments, even the most decorated aces admitted what they could never say publicly. The war in the air was lost. While the Mustang represented technological triumph, its role in the broader Allied strategy raised moral questions that historians still debate. Daylight bombing, chosen deliberately by American planners to target industrial precision, often blurred into devastation. Factories were indeed destroyed, but so were cities. Civilians in places like Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Leipzig bore the brunt of an air war that had evolved beyond simple military necessity. The addition of long-range escorts meant the bombers could now strike anywhere, anytime. And they did. To the Americans, it was a grim necessity. To end the war, Germany's ability to fight had to be annihilated at its roots. Its oil, steel, and transport networks. The Mustang made that possible. Yet for the men flying those missions, the line between duty and destruction grew painfully thin. Bomber crews watched from 25,000 feet as flames consumed entire districts. Fighter pilots saw trains, vehicles, and fleeing troops turn to wreckage. War had become impersonal, almost mechanical. Victory measured not by ground gained, but by tonnage dropped. The Luftwaffe, in turn, mirrored this shift. Unable to win in the air, it turned its remaining strength toward vengeance. V-1 flying bombs, V-2 rockets, and desperate attempts to terrorize Allied cities in return. It was the grim logic of total war. When one side loses the power to fight conventionally, morality gives way to survival. The Mustang didn't create that logic, but it enforced it. It made the Allied bombing offensive unstoppable, turning what had been a contest of armies into a struggle of entire societies. For those watching from the ground, both German and Allied, the sky no longer represented courage or adventure. It represented judgment. In every great struggle, leadership defines the outcome as much as machines. On opposite sides of Europe, two men embodied the changing tides of the air war. Hermann Göring, once the proud architect of the Luftwaffe, now found himself trapped by his own mythology. Surrounded by loyalists and sycophants, he continued to assure Hitler that the skies were secure, even as reports proved otherwise. His obsession with prestige projects, the Me-262, the giant He-177 bombers, drained resources from where they were needed most. He dismissed bad news, silenced dissent, and placed faith in miracles rather than reform. To his pilots, once devoted to him, Göring's words became hollow. His authority waned with every downed squadron. Meanwhile, in England, General James Doolittle represented the opposite kind of leadership: flexible, ruthless, and grounded in results. A former racer and engineer, Doolittle understood air combat as both science and art. His decision to free the Mustangs from rigid escort patterns changed everything. Instead of reactive defense, he turned the 8th Air Force into a weapon of offense. Instead of protecting bombers at all costs, he chose to destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it lived. Doolittle's approach was controversial. Some argued it sacrificed immediate bomber safety. But within months, his strategy paid dividends that no one could dispute. German losses skyrocketed. Bomber survival rates improved. The difference between Göring and Doolittle was not one of patriotism, but of perception. Göring clung to the past, to symbols of honor and supremacy. Doolittle embraced adaptation, technology, and total commitment. Their decisions shaped the fate of nations and the future of aerial warfare itself. By spring 1944, the results were undeniable. The Luftwaffe was dying, and the Americans were taking control of the sky inch by inch, mission by mission. The next battles would decide whether that control could be turned into victory, not just in the air, but across the whole of Europe. The stage was set for the storm to come, the turning point that would change the war forever. By February 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its breaking point. The Allies knew that if they could not destroy the Luftwaffe before the planned invasion of France, the beaches of Normandy would become a slaughterhouse. It was time to strike, not cautiously, but decisively. The plan was codenamed Operation Argument. Historians would later call it Big Week. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched an unprecedented bombing campaign across the German Reich. The targets: aircraft factories, assembly plants, engine works, the heart of the Luftwaffe's production. It was a calculated gamble. If successful, it would cripple German air power. If it failed, Allied bomber forces could be broken beyond repair. The bombers rose before dawn. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators lumbering into the cold sky. Their contrails stretched like white veins across the clouds, and this time they were not alone. Above them, weaving in graceful arcs, flew the P-51 Mustangs. This was the first time in the war that American bombers would be escorted deep into central Germany by fighters that could stay with them the entire way. The difference was immediate and catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. German radar screens lit up as the formations approached. Controllers scrambled every available interceptor. Bases from Hanover to Augsburg roared to life with the sound of Daimler-Benz and BMW engines. Veteran pilots climbed into their cockpits with the same ritual precision: gloves, oxygen, faith. But as they reached altitude, something felt wrong. The Mustangs were waiting. No longer confined to tight escort boxes, the P-51s roamed ahead and above the bombers, hunting. They struck before the Germans could even organize. Luftwaffe squadrons, already stretched thin, found themselves ambushed over their own territory. Dogfights erupted across hundreds of miles of sky. Contrails spiraled into chaos. Silver arcs and black smoke twisting together in lethal choreography. The Luftwaffe still fought with ferocity. Aces like Walter Nowotny and Otto Kittel scored kills even in impossible odds. But for every Allied bomber they brought down, 3 or 4 German fighters failed to return. Big Week was not one battle. It was 6 consecutive days of relentless assault. Factories at Regensburg, Leipzig, Brunswick, and Schweinfurt burned under waves of precision bombing. The Mustang squadrons stayed overhead, striking retreating fighters, strafing airfields, cutting off reinforcements. German command posts were overwhelmed. Reports flooded in faster than they could be processed. Whole Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings, were annihilated in the air or on the ground. By the end of the campaign, the Luftwaffe had lost over 600 aircraft. And more critically, hundreds of its irreplaceable veteran pilots. The Allies paid heavily, too. Over 250 bombers and thousands of men. But unlike the Luftwaffe, they could replace their losses. The psychological shift was total. Until that week, German airmen believed they could still hold the line. After Big Week, even the most optimistic officers understood the truth. The Reich could no longer defend its skies on equal terms. Factories could be rebuilt, but experience could not. The Luftwaffe's pilot corps, the living memory of its golden era, was being erased. General Doolittle's decision to unleash the Mustangs had proven devastatingly effective. By hunting the hunters, the Americans had forced the Luftwaffe into continuous combat, burning through what little fuel, aircraft, and manpower it had left. For Göring, the reports were intolerable. He demanded explanations, new tactics, new miracle weapons. But behind his anger lay panic. The German war machine was bleeding from every pore. Big Week had broken something deeper than just production lines. It shattered the illusion of control. The Luftwaffe, for all its bravery, was now reacting to an enemy it could no longer outthink or outlast. In the quiet aftermath of those days, the wreckage told the story. Across airfields in Germany, the twisted remains of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lay scattered, half buried in snow. Mechanics salvaged what they could. Pilots stared silently at the empty bunks in their barracks. Above them, in the cold, clear sky, the contrails of returning Mustangs drifted west, symbols of a new era dawning. Big Week was more than a victory. It was a declaration. The Luftwaffe was no longer the master of the air, but for the Allies, it was only the beginning. The true test of supremacy was still to come. In the months leading to D-Day, when every flight, every mission, would decide the fate of the invasion. And in those months, the P-51 would become something more than an escort. It would become a weapon of domination. By April 1944, the skies over Europe belonged to no one. They were a graveyard in motion. The Luftwaffe still fought, but its formations had grown thin, its aces fewer, its confidence hollow. The Big Week had not destroyed it outright, but it had torn the heart from its command. Allied intelligence knew it, and General James Doolittle intended to finish what he'd begun. Under his orders, the Mustangs' role shifted dramatically. No longer were the P-51s to cling to bomber boxes as passive escorts. Their new mission was freedom of the hunt. They would roam ahead of the bombers, sweep enemy airfields, and annihilate any aircraft that dared to rise. What followed was a transformation of the air war unlike anything the Germans had ever seen. At dawn, hundreds of Mustangs lifted from airfields in England, engines rumbling like distant thunder. They flew not in defense, but in pursuit. Across the Channel they went, streaking low over the North Sea, then rising into the hazy skies of occupied Europe. Their targets were not just interceptors. They struck at the roots of German air power. They strafed runways at Jülich, Münster, and Kassel, tore through trains carrying fuel and ammunition, and raked columns of trucks heading to air depots. German radar often saw them too late. By the time warning sirens wailed, the Mustangs were already diving on the fields, cannons blazing, fuel tanks exploding, aircraft shredded before takeoff. For the first time in the war, Luftwaffe pilots felt hunted in their own homeland. There was no safety anywhere. Not in the air, not on the ground. Every mission exacted a heavier price. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline could no longer keep up. New pilots arrived at the front with barely 100 hours in the air, often less. They were sent straight into combat against seasoned Mustang and Thunderbolt squadrons. Most did not survive their first sortie. Meanwhile, the Allied pilots were learning, adapting, perfecting. They developed new tactics, high-speed slashing attacks, coordinated climbs, and rolling scissors maneuvers that exploited the Mustang's agility. Veterans like George Preddy, Don Gentile, and John Meyer racked up staggering kill counts. In some squadrons, pilots returned from missions with gun barrels still smoking, and others never returned at all. The air war was merciless, but increasingly one-sided. By May 1944, Allied command had one goal: absolute air supremacy over northern France. Without it, the coming invasion of Normandy would be impossible. The Mustangs led the way. They swept deep into France and the Low Countries, hammering German transport networks and decimating the Luftwaffe's forward bases. Every bridge, every rail line, every convoy that might carry reinforcements to the coast was targeted. German commanders were left shouting into broken radios. Their fighters could barely take off before being intercepted. Fuel was scarce, airfields bombed, pilots exhausted. When the weather cleared, the skies were filled with silver wings, endless streams of B-17s and B-24s, escorted by Mustangs so numerous that some bomber crews joked, "We have more fighters than the Germans have planes." It was no exaggeration. On the eve of June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fewer than 500 serviceable fighters remained across Western Europe. Many were grounded by fuel shortages or maintenance failures. The proud force that once terrorized the skies of Poland, France, and Britain was now fragmented, scattered, and exhausted. And yet, they still flew. When word reached German bases that the Allies had landed in Normandy, desperate orders went out. All aircraft to the invasion front. A handful of FW-190s and Bf-109s scrambled into the morning haze over the beaches. What they found waiting for them was an ocean of aircraft. Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Typhoons, Lightnings, an entire sky owned by the Allies. The few Luftwaffe squadrons that tried to attack the beachhead were cut down in minutes. Pilots like Joseph Priller and Heinz, Wlodarczyk made heroic solo passes over the invasion zone, isolated gestures of defiance against an unstoppable tide. The Luftwaffe's ability to influence. The battle for Normandy was over before it began. By midsummer 1944, the outcome was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, symbol of its technological might and discipline, was broken. The reasons were many: the industrial weight of America, the relentless courage of Allied crews, the devastating efficiency of the Mustang. But more than anything, it was time. The Luftwaffe had been built for short wars, decisive campaigns, quick victories. The Allied air war was one of endurance, of endless production, endless pilots, endless pressure. By autumn, Allied bombers were striking Berlin, Munich, and Vienna with near impunity. The sky that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the world's new masters of the air. On the ground, German children looked up at the white trails stretching across the heavens and knew the war had turned. And somewhere, far above the clouds, a P-51 Mustang cut through the sun, its propeller flashing silver light. Its pilot, a young man thousands of miles from home, banked gently toward the west, leaving behind the wreckage of an empire that had once believed itself invincible. The hunters had become legends. The Luftwaffe had become memory. By the start of 1945, the sky over Europe had changed beyond recognition. Where once the Luftwaffe had soared with confidence, now only fragments of its former glory remained. Scattered squadrons, battered airfields, and pilots fighting without hope of victory. The American Mustangs and British Spitfires now roamed the skies at will. The U.S. 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command executed round-the-clock missions by day and by night. Cities burned beneath them: Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, each becoming an inferno in the Allied campaign to break Germany's industrial backbone. The Luftwaffe tried to resist, but by early 1945, it was no longer the precision instrument of 1939. It was a patchwork of desperate measures: boys barely out of training, obsolete aircraft pulled from storage, and experimental jets rushed into service without fuel or spares. The numbers told the story. In 1939, the Luftwaffe had been the most advanced and numerous air force in Europe. By January 1945, less than one-third of its aircraft were operational. Most sat grounded, engines silent, waiting for fuel that never came. The loss of air superiority wasn't just strategic, it was personal. For the German people, Allied bombers had become an unending presence. Sirens screamed through the night. Families huddled in cellars as the sky roared with the drone of thousands of engines. Cities that once stood proud became ruins of brick and ash. In the air, the cost was just as human. Young German pilots, many from the Hitler Youth, were rushed into cockpits with barely 40 hours of flight experience. They climbed into Bf-109s and FW-190s knowing the odds. Most would not return. Some never even reached altitude before being intercepted. In contrast, the American and British airmen who once feared the black crosses of the Luftwaffe now faced dwindling opposition. Yet their missions remained deadly. Flak batteries still tore holes through formations. Even as victory approached, bombers fell, men were lost, and death never truly left the skies. But there was a quiet shift in tone. From fear to dominance. Crews spoke of owning the air. The name Mustang had become synonymous with freedom, precision, and vengeance. Desperation gave birth to innovation, too late to change the war's course. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, finally entered service in 1944. It was faster, deadlier, and decades ahead of its time. German aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny saw in it a chance, perhaps the last, to strike back. But even the jet could not save the Reich. Fuel shortages crippled operations, Allied bombers destroyed production plants, and the chaos of retreat turned logistics into ruins. The Me-262s that did fly often faced swarms of Mustangs waiting to pounce as they took off or landed. The age of the piston engine was ending, but not in Germany's favor. The Mustang had ruled its final chapter with unmatched balance, speed, range, and grace. By March 1945, the air war was no longer a contest. It was a clean sweep. Allied bombers ranged unchallenged from the Rhine to the Oder, from the Alps to the Baltic. The Luftwaffe existed only in name. On the ground, German officers could only watch as streams of contrails stretched across their skies. Endless, pale lines marking the high-altitude advance of Allied power. Each streak was a reminder. The air, once their kingdom, was gone forever. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the Luftwaffe died with it. Its final missions were chaotic, symbolic, and futile, sorties flown to defend a city already consumed by defeat. The pilots who survived captivity spoke later with the same haunted clarity. "We ruled the skies once. Then, one day, they came, and we never ruled again." The American Mustang had not just won air battles, it had ended an era. It had proven that reach, endurance, and coordination could overcome even the fiercest skill and spirit. And yet, even amid victory, the destruction below was hard to ignore. Entire cities erased, millions displaced, the air war's triumph shadowed by its terrible cost. The Mustang had brought dominance, but it had also revealed the price of that power. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the once proud Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a memory scattered across airfields and wreckage. The surrender order came not through the roar of engines, but through silence. In hangars across Bavaria, Saxony, and the Rhineland, aircraft sat abandoned. Wings riddled with holes, propellers bent, insignia blackened with soot. The end was as much psychological as it was military. Men who once flew with the arrogance of mastery now walked as prisoners. Their leather flight jackets and insignia, once marks of elite status, had become relics of a vanished power. The world that followed would be shaped by what they had learned and by what they had lost. The collapse of the Luftwaffe reshaped the understanding of air warfare. Before the war, Germany had proven that air power could break armies and cities alike. But it had also proven that no air force, no matter how skilled, could sustain itself without production, fuel, and reach. The P-51 Mustang symbolized that transformation. Its long-range escort missions demonstrated the strategic truth of the modern era. Victory in the air demanded endurance, not proximity. A nation that could produce, refuel, and project power over vast distances would always dominate those who could not. For the Allies, this revelation became doctrine. When the U.S. Air Force was established as an independent branch in 1947, its core philosophy, global reach, global power, came directly from the lessons of the 8th Air Force and the Mustangs that led them. The Luftwaffe, once the teacher, had become the warning. For German pilots, the war's end brought complex emotions: guilt, pride, disillusionment, and respect for their adversaries. Aces like Adolf Galland and Günter Rall survived the war, many later working with Allied air forces in advisory roles during the Cold War. They spoke candidly of their opponents, describing the Mustang as the perfect balance of engineering and purpose. Some even admitted admiration for the courage of the American bomber crews they once hunted. They knew too well what it meant to fight against impossible odds. They had lived it from the other side. Many Allied pilots, too, remembered their enemies not as monsters, but as men. Skilled, relentless, and trapped in the machinery of a doomed empire. Decades later, reunions and interviews between former foes carried an almost sacred tone, a shared recognition of how narrow survival had been. The Mustang's story did not end in 1945. It served in Korea, Israel, and dozens of smaller conflicts long after the war that birthed it had ended. Pilots loved it for the same reasons the Germans feared it: speed, range, balance, and beauty. In the post-war years, engineers studied its design to shape the next generation of aircraft, jets that would inherit its aerodynamic elegance and efficiency. The name Mustang became shorthand for what aviation could achieve when necessity met brilliance. It was not just a machine. It was a statement that innovation and persistence could shift the course of history. For the defeated nation, the legacy of its air war was one of paradox. The same Luftwaffe that had once represented technological pride became a cautionary tale of overreach, of how arrogance and fragmentation destroyed what brilliance had built. When West Germany rebuilt its air force in the 1950s, many of its doctrines were borrowed directly from the Allied model, emphasizing flexibility, endurance, and coordination rather than speed and surprise. The myth of air invincibility had died in 1944. In its place stood a more sober truth. Mastery of the air was not about individual skill, but about system, supply, and strategy. By the late 1940s, the world's skies had changed forever. Jet engines roared where propellers once spun. Nations built bombers capable of reaching across oceans. The lessons of the Mustangs' long-range dominance became the foundation of nuclear-era deterrence and modern air command. But beneath that technological progress lay a haunting echo, the millions lost to the firestorms and the thunder. Above, the war in the air had proven humanity's reach and its recklessness. The Mustangs had given the Allies victory, but they had also left a scar that would shape every air war to come. In that twilight between old and new eras, the skies grew quiet again, no longer ruled by anyone, only watched. And on forgotten airfields across Europe, a few weathered Mustangs and shattered Messerschmitts sat under tarps and dust, relics of a time when men believed they could rule the heavens by force alone. The world would never look at the sky the same way again. The war in the air had begun as a contest of machines, but it ended as a revelation about humanity itself. For 6 years, men from every nation had risen into the clouds, believing they could master the sky. They learned instead that mastery came with a terrible cost. The Luftwaffe had taught the world what air power could achieve: speed, precision, terror. The Mustang had taught what air power required: patience, endurance, and vision. Between them lay the story of an age when courage met technology, and when belief in invincibility met the unrelenting weight of reality. In 1939, German pilots ruled with confidence, certain that their machines and training made them untouchable. By 1945, that certainty had fallen burning through the clouds, replaced by the slow understanding that no one rules the sky forever. The P-51 Mustang was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of an idea, that freedom of the air depended on freedom of the mind. It was born from cooperation, necessity, and the will to adapt. It arrived not as a miracle, but as a culmination of lessons written in loss. Its long wings carried not only bombs and bullets, but the weight of every lesson the early war had carved into the sky, from the ruins of Warsaw to the smoke of Hamburg. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not merely Germany's fall, it was a turning point for the world's understanding of war itself. From that moment on, every nation knew that the battle for the ground would always begin in the air. And yet, beyond the numbers, the victories, and the wreckage, something quieter endures, a shared memory of those who flew. Enemies who once fought to kill each other now meet as old men, shaking hands beside museum aircraft polished to a mirror shine. They look up, and for a brief moment, they remember what it meant to chase the horizon at 20,000 feet, to be young, afraid, and alive beneath an infinite sky. The war ended, but the sky remained vast, silent, and unclaimed. It reminds us still that power is never permanent, only borrowed, and that every empire, no matter how high it flies, must one day return to Earth.